After the semi-recent release of Silent Hill 2 Remake as of making this video, I've gone back into a full survival horror kick. A genre that has been near and dear to my heart for years, survival horror makes me feel a special kind of immersed in the horror. When the biggest battle is running out of resources, and it feels like I myself am the one responsible for the main character living or dying. During this kick, I've been re-experiencing a lot of my favorite classics, but I'd also been wanting to discover something new. And that was when I was tipped off on a little indie game called Alisa by Casper Croes, a survival horror based on PS1 era horror, especially OG Resident Evil. I was also quite intrigued by the game's clockwork doll aesthetic it had going on, and decided I needed to check it out for myself. In Alisa, you play as, well, Alisa, a soldier for some sort of empire based on a very loose World War I European setting. Some sort of blueprints were stolen, and the Emperor has tasked a handful of people with combing the countryside in an effort to get the blueprints back. While hunting down this spy, Alisa gets separated from her partner who chokes on his toothpick when tripping, and eventually gets captured and stuck in the Dollhouse, a large mansion-esque structure filled with all sorts of mechanical dolls hell-bent on making sure you stay here forever. Alisa is a fairly classic survival horror experience, and the tone and overall aesthetics are immaculate. Graphically, the game looks directly ripped from the PS1, and could easily have fit in during that time period. The lower poly designs take on an era-appropriate amount of detail that simply oozes with nostalgia, and there are even some FMV cutscenes here and there for bigger moments that add to the aesthetic tremendously. Beyond just the looks, the sound of the game also sounds straight from that era, including my personal favorite element, the voice acting. And while the voice acting isn't what would necessarily be considered good by modern standards per se, it really adds to the intended atmosphere of the game, and you can tell that all the VAs had a ton of fun with their roles.
Oh, yes! Someone new has come to have some fun!
Of course, any game worth its salt is more than just its aesthetics, and Alisa is no exception to this. Just like how Alisa feels and sounds like a classic survival horror experience, it also plays like one. The game gives you two different movement options, a classic tank control option and a modern option, and full disclosure, I only played this game with tank controls, as I was fresh off a Resident Evil playthrough, and it felt more right for the experience Alisa was advertising. But the modern option is there for people who feel that it's too clunky for their own enjoyment. A little bit of a clunky element that doesn't work for me is that you can only control the entire game with either the joystick or the D-pad if you're on controller. You have to choose which one in the settings. While this isn't awful, it definitely threw me off by not allowing me to joystick move and D-pad menu, but it's ultimately more of a nitpick than anything else. One of the most important elements of survival horror are the weapons, and there are a number of them for you to play around with across the game, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. You've got some classics like a pistol, a blunderbuss that's functionally the shotgun, a revolver, and there's even actually a fully auto machine gun, something that is a bit less common in horror games, I feel like. Though, even among the various weapons, the one that stands out to me is actually the sword. You can acquire the sword fairly early in your experience, but it can easily become a loadout mainstay for the entire game. This is because the sword does fairly reasonable damage for being a melee, and more importantly, it has a sort of parry mechanic that allows you to deflect damage from most enemies with proper timing. Mastering the sword will carry you far in this game, allowing you to do decent damage while taking minimal, and also conserving your limited ammo, which is obviously a must for any survival horror. As is typical for the genre, safe rooms exist for when you need a break from the action. Within safe rooms are two important characters, Paul and Charlotte. Paul is a hand puppet in the wall you encounter very early in the game, and he acts as a merchant of sorts. Whenever you kill any enemy in the game, they drop a form of currency known as tooth wheels, and you can utilize these tooth wheels to purchase ammo and healing items from Paul, as well as new weapons and even dresses, which change your stats in meaningful ways. You start with access to very little, but his inventory shop opens more and more the further you progress into the game. Paul is also how you save your game, costing a static 1 tooth wheel each time. Even though it's consistently very cheap, the fact you have to purchase your saves means even saving your progress technically becomes one more resource to manage over the course of the game, though not quite as severely as ink ribbons are in Resident Evil. Eventually, you'll also get access to an additional shop for modifications, which grant you items with permanent passive buffs, though you must be careful, as while they seem great on the surface, the modifications might have a cost bigger than you think. Charlotte, on the other hand, has a lot less going on for her. Unlike Paul, she doesn't even speak or interact with you at all. Instead, she's functionally the item box. Though because your inventory is technically unlimited, her main purpose is to let you swap out your weapons and dress, as you can only have 2 weapons and 1 dress equipped at any given time. A bit less involved of a mechanic, but no less important. The dollhouse as an environment is fairly enclosed for the most part, an environment with many individual rooms, though still a degree of linear progression. The game is fairly straightforward in conveying where exactly you should be going, though sometimes the game is a little less obvious if you aren't interacting with or reading everything. There was at least one time where the game felt weirdly unclear about where exactly I should go next, in a way that kinda confused me, but it wasn't anything too detrimental, and it was something I was still able to figure out without a lot of aimless wandering. Access to other areas are usually locked behind puzzles, which require exploring more or less the entire portion of any given area to find the solutions for. Most of the puzzles just require placing one item in another place, but occasionally you get more involved puzzles that actually require you to physically move around items. The puzzles are never too difficult, aside from one specific timed puzzle. You'll know which one if you play. Though if you're like me, some of them might be a bit time-consuming still. And in fairly regular survival horror tradition, the end of each area contains a boss fight. The bosses are never super challenging, though you may need to actually plan out your loadout to ensure you fight them well. Defeating each boss also opens up a new menu of boss rewards in Pole's shop, which nets you one item from a list, though still at the cost of tooth wheels. While I didn't mess around with these a lot, they seem like a lot of fun, albeit with some being very blatantly more useful than others. The story for the game is ultimately a fairly basic story, though kinda like early Resident Evil entries, I never felt like it needed to be much of anything more. Though even then, there's a lot of hidden lore found across the game within scattered notes on the ground that actually open up the story in more interesting directions. I won't really get into that here, however, to leave you something to go find for yourself. The game also, as is tradition in such a genre, has a decent bit of replayability. The game has 3 endings labeled A, B, and C, which are influenced by certain decisions throughout the course of the game. And beyond this, there's also a New Game Plus system that functions kind of like Dark Souls is, where the game gets slightly harder, but you keep everything you had from the start, which gives you more reason to explore everything and play around with all the shiny toys in your arsenal. That being said though, this actually does lead into quite possibly my biggest complaint about this game, something that harms what would otherwise be a more or less perfect survival horror experience to me. But I can't really talk about it without any sort of spoilers, as it has to do with the handling of the game's endings. So if you want to go into this experience as pure as possible, I will leave a timestamp on the screen to skip this section and give you a few seconds to jump ahead. Everyone ready? Okay. So as mentioned, the game has 3 endings. I mentioned that certain choices are what dictate your ending, but it's actually a very specific choice. You see, your ending is actually dictated based on whether or not you purchased any of the modifications that I mentioned earlier, which is what that cost was that I had alluded to. Simply put, ending A means you bought 0 modifications, ending B means you bought some of them, and ending C means you bought all of them. Sounds pretty simple, right? Almost Bioshocky in its nature, really. And I would agree with that. I actually conceptually do really like this. But there's a slight issue. The game doesn't really give you any sort of indicators about this until after you already get the ending, where the final boss more or less blatantly tells you what you did wrong.
You can't resist the moment you were injected with admissions tooth wheels. You became bound to this place.
My first playthrough actually netted me ending B due to having purchased some of the mods that sounded nice. And this mildly sucks, but like, whatever, I thought. The ending screen indicated the existence of a New Game Plus, which would let me just play again to get another ending, giving me more reason to play this game that I've come to love. So I loaded up the New Game Plus save and quickly realized that everything carries over, including my modifications that I had purchased. This means that I didn't just doom my previous playthrough, I doomed every subsequent playthrough on this save file, pigeonholing it into either ending B or ending C forever. This is kinda my biggest problem with the game, because there's no way of knowing that you've screwed an entire save file until after it's already happened. And like, yeah, I can just start a different save slot to get ending A, but it kinda sucks that if I want to go get that ending, I have to start from scratch and not have the possibility of enjoying a New Game Plus experience doing so. So ultimately, it isn't really the end of the world, but unfortunately this is something that does negatively impact the rest of the experience, at least a little bit, I feel. At the end of the day, though, that being my biggest problem means I would still very easily recommend this game to any survival horror fans. It's a very enjoyable experience from beginning to end, with a fun atmosphere, fun combat, fun puzzles, fun exploration, some solid replayability, And the biggest kicker, the game isn't very long. In a landscape where games pride themselves on getting longer and longer, this game is a nice short experience. My first playthrough only clocking in at about 5 hours. So if you want just a good, short gaming experience, this game is definitely one for you. I'll leave links in the description so that you can purchase the game and support the dev if you're interested. And speaking of the dev, Casper Croes announced Alisa the Parting, a sequel to Alisa that will even come with co-op, which I'm extremely excited for. Hopefully he takes everything that worked from the first game and doubles down. Maybe you'll see me discussing it when it finally drops. We'll have to see. Anyway, if you're still around by this point, I hope you have a good day, evening, night, or whatever it is. Thank you for watching.